So I was asking if there will be musical accompaniment with the next presentation. The answer is no, but Frank Harte will be talking to us about thriving during the Depression, shared history of Black baseball and jazz in Kansas City during the 1930s.
Good afternoon. Yeah, the music, I'm so bummed out. I had two great jazz pieces selected, but I made this on Keynote. I tried to flip it to PowerPoint and I lost my audio file. I know you're great historians or a great passion for history here, and I thought I'd recognize that today is the 80th anniversary of the D-Day invasion. Last night I saw that the average age of a soldier who passed away was 22, so I can't imagine what a tragedy that was. My best friend Tommy got me excited about Black baseball history and jazz, a bunch of years ago. And so at any point during the presentation or afterwards, if you are disappointed, do not shoot the messenger. Tommy is actually the root cause of any problems that may arise here today. So I was trying to find a historical thread to, talk about this relationship between jazz and Black baseball. And I kind of came to Kansas City during the Depression, during the 30s. And I think it's kind of an interesting geographic and cultural and economic situation because it's actually the flip of what was going on nationally. The Great Depression, like the images that come to our minds, are compelling and frightening. People who are destitute on lines block long waiting for soup or just simple foods, or their families riding together in cars with all their belongings on top of the car, wandering the highways or urban encampments of the homeless. And so the images reflect the incredible economic hardship and social hardship that accompanied the Great Depression. But ironically, while the nation was suffering profoundly, there was this little oasis in Kansas City. Throughout the Depression, they had economic stability, a good sense of community, and their culture thrived. The jazz scene was vibrant, and I think under the leadership of J.L. Wilkinson, decided to support barnstorming as the way to go in terms of surviving the Depression. There wasn't enough attendance at home games to make a go of it economically. And so here you have Kansas City thriving. And, oops. So during the 20s, just to bookend this a little bit, the Great Migration had happened roughly after World War I, and to develop sizable Afro-American communities in the urbanized and segregated North. Kansas City was a relatively small city in terms of a Black population. Around 1930, they had like 35,000 Black residents. New York, for example, had roughly 400,000. But these congregated Black communities were able to, economically support Black baseball, promote the renaissance of the arts in Harlem, in literature and music, and same thing happened in Pittsburgh, not as well known, and Chicago. And there was an ongoing maturity of Black social institutions like the NAACP, and the foundation, of course, for a lot of the economic and moral strength of these initiatives was in the Baptist and the African-American Methodist and Episcopalian Church. So everyone knows that photo of Rue Foster in the middle, and what an incredible individual. And I think with not just his background, but his incredible executive skills, kind of willed the Negro National League into formation. It just, to me, it is astounding. And while he was doing that, of course, there were tremendous social and economic and organizational reasons or obstacles in the way throughout the duration of the Negro National League. And I won't label them all, but we're certainly, aware of the lack of stadiums and the avaricious leasing agreements. You heard about the Yankees and how much money they made. I think the Senators were even worse. Certainly the the schedule makers, the agents for the schedule makers, they took your 5 or 10% off the top and certainly controlled who played when and where. And on the map, let me see how, it comes out pretty good. Obviously, Kansas City is the westernmost city in the Negro National Leagues. And so transportation costs during the 20s and 30s were significant. And so most of the money in the Negro National Leagues was made on the Sundays. Other teams didn't want to spend all that money to come to Kansas City, and Kansas City, quite frankly, didn't want to spend all that money traveling to the other sites. And of course, in the midst of all this, the players are jumping and the management are poaching. So, excuse me. So you have the Great Depression and its devastation meeting Negro National Leagues, and the demise is obvious. Now, about 1,600 river miles south of Kansas City, in New Orleans, a new musical genre is forming, jazz. And it's made up of elements of Southern rural blues, ragtime, Creole traditions, and then their call and response patterns, which came to America with African enslavement. And they accentuated, or the patterns were accentuated by improvisational harmonies and instrumentation. They made up the majority of the jazz formation. And jazz rapidly spread throughout the 1920s. They took advantage of the improved transportation infrastructure, so that certainly allowed for barnstorming. Barnstorming was key because the typical gig in jazz was 1 or 2 days. It was rare to have a whole week in one place. So that was a real opportunity to hone your skills and to make a living. And prohibition at the time, liquor sales, of course, never declined. And most of the venues for the African-American musicians to play in were mobster run. They had to have entertainment in their speakeasies. And depending on what city you were in Kansas City, they had jam and cutting sessions where you could ply your trade, meet with the other musicians, and not only improve your skill, but improve your reputation. Kansas City, they were a Monday night event, Monday morning event from 3 in the morning to 7. New York City, they were a Sunday night event from 3 a.m. to 7. So that's when you are really learning your art. At the same time in the 20s, you have advancement in record technology, and the radio helps disseminate the jazz craze. And by 1930, this was the popular music. Jazz accounted for over 70% of all American record sales. So it was the dominant music. And of course, Kansas City jazz was kind of up-tempo, very rhythmic, and it sort of coincided and promoted the American dance craze. Don't give old people laptops. So the stock market crash hits. It's October of 29 now. And the Monarchs are an established baseball franchise. And jazz is vibrant in Kansas City. So things are looking good. Nationally, by this time, national unemployment was like 25%. Urban Black unemployment in the North was roughly 60%. And The third image over, I had an opportunity to visit the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. And it's the most incredible experience. It's made up kind of like a quadrangle, a cloistered quadrangle, and these metal rods, you know, hang literally from the ceiling. Each rod represents a county in our country, and on each rod is etched the name of the person who was hanged in that county or lynched, excuse me. And so throughout the 30s, you know, there was no policing really, or effective policing of white supremacist terrorism. And I'm just thinking of being a jazz musician, that's not going to happen, or a ball player. I thought that would happen, and imagine dealing with the overriding or overarching fear of lynching, how frightening. In the 1930s, even though numbers were quote unquote declining, there was still lynching on average every 15 days. And at that same time, there had already been a 40-year campaign to pass federal anti-lynching legislation, you know, led by Ida B. Wells and William Du Bois through his work with the NAACP. The second image is Tom Pendergast. He was the unelected czar of Kansas City. He ran Kansas City politically from 1925 to 1939. And he controlled the city and county corrupt democratic machine that had a lot of tentacles reaching well into the state and federal levels. And he tacitly supported and profited from the mobster-run vice in KC, prostitution, and gambling, illicit liquor sales, etc. Buck O'Neill said everything went in Kansas City, and it became known as the Paris of the Plains. It's much like modern-day Cooperstown. In 2 weeks before the stock market crashed, so timing is everything, Pendergast announced a $50 million infrastructure program. Again, those are federal dollars, but it sounds like it's coming out of Tom's back pocket. And the money stabilizes the economy, gives them a good sense of community, and employment booms. And with that, in Kansas City, you have over 120 jazz clubs. One of them owned by Pendergast, of course. And you had over 300 bars, saloons, and hotels, all having music every night. So employment opportunities were wonderful in Kansas City for jazz musicians. And also, it became kind of the place to go to collaborate and improve your skills. So people like Count Basie, Mary Lou Williams, Jay McShann, Andy Kirk, these are outsiders who came in, fell in love with the jazz scene in Kansas City, and decided to stay for 8 or 10 years. And meanwhile, you had the recognized talents of Duke Ellington, Lionel Hampton, Cab Calloway. Again, they were enjoying how vibrant the jazz scene was in Kansas City. And over time, there was a real appreciation for this very rich musical conservatory experience living and breathing in Kansas City. It also existed, as we'll see, in the territories, the areas around urban Kansas City. I won't go into J.L. Wilkinson because I know he'll throw something at me, so I'm not going to do that. But I want to say one thing. Having attended a conference recently, the gentleman said, history is all about leadership. And I think that is so critical when it comes to Monarch success. This is a well-respected sports executive by Black and white players, business executives, etc. Obviously, he was, I won't go into this whole white owner of a black baseball team at that time. But when the Depression hit and there's no black leisure dollars to support baseball, having someone like Wilkinson there to guide them through the economic hardship and make the barnstorming decisions and make that successful was key to the Monarchs' success. And I think another aspect of Wilkinson's life and performance in Kansas City was his great relationship with the community. So again, it's the smallest in terms of the market size of a Negro National League team, but they had the largest booster club. It had more than 500 active members. And so, you know, they would organize jazz concerts before the Monarch games. They would raise funds. They would, you know, try to get the citizens to come out and support the Monarchs, and business to support them financially. Now, if you were a musician or a ball player in Kansas City, you were a celebrity. So typically on a Sunday doubleheader, a lot of the fans would come out in full dress, many coming directly from church, and the images, you know, the photographic images are fantastic. A jazz concert might happen right before the game organized by the boosters. And it was kind of the place to be and the place to be seen. If you were Lionel Hampton, who was an absolute Monarch nut, you would be in the dugout in full Monarch uniform or even coaching the bass lines. So Casey musicians were avid Monarch fans. And as you know, Cab Calloway, Bill Bojangles, Louis Armstrong, and Duke Ellington at one time were full or partial owners in black baseball teams. And in KC, the Monarchs were very much supported by Count Basie, Lena Horne, Ella Fitzgerald, and Charlie Parker, all again avid fans. And I think this is kind of one of the benefits of these smaller communities, where they can reach each other, communicate, and appreciate each other's talents. And of course, after the game, everyone would head up to 18th and Vine and enjoy the jazz scene and the community atmosphere. And by everyone, I mean both the players and management. Jackie Robinson also was a Monarch in 1945 and also a great jazz aficionado. He organized Jazz on the Grass. It was performed at his estate in Stamford, Connecticut. So he brought in great jazz performers, raised money, he became a major fundraiser for the civil rights movements all throughout the 60s. So I like to think of ball players and jazz musicians as diurnal and nocturnal complements. They were artistically entertaining, but very supportive of each other. That's that sense of community again, and they were very much supported by their community. And I think their combined efforts of these three elements brought a lot of joy and dignity and money to the Black community of Kansas City during the Depression. So obviously, with everyone having a good time in Kansas City, language and lifestyle has its overlaps. If you want to succeed in baseball, if you want to succeed in music, it's going to require years of preparation, a lot of practice, some muscle memory, a commitment to teamwork, and basic skill. And both of these disciplines, they talk about swing as a noun and a verb. You can think about that a little bit. They both strive for hits. They play on a team or an orchestra, and they refer to players and playing. So a lot of language overlap. But jazz musicians and Black ball players, same thing. If they have talent and ambition, you know, Black ball players look for opportunities to jump to make more money. And if you were a band player, you would do the same thing. You jump to another band. Both groups barnstormed routinely across America and Canada and they brought high-quality art and entertainment to culturally starved communities. They had communities in the Plain States, out of Midwest, that were called sundown times, where Black residents had curfews. They weren't allowed out at night. But apparently a jazz concert or a night baseball game, which became popular, were acceptable, if you can imagine, reasons to allow Black citizens to enjoy the entertainment. For lots of reasons, they followed similar circuits. They ate in similar restaurants, stayed at Black-friendly accommodations. At the time of vaudeville, there was a group called the Theater Owners Booking Association, and they would book vaudevillian acts into venues that accepted Black performers. And later it transitioned to a thing called the Chitlin Circuit, and that was the same thing. One of the basic things was to, find venues that would promote, tier 2 type players who were trying to hone their craft, so they could play in front of crowds or people, and then be assured that after playing they would get a meal and a place to stay. So the Chitlin Circuit, or in the territories, was critical to the evolution of jazz and baseball. Jazz, rather, sorry. What's interesting also when we talk about integration, reintegration, and the different terms, it tries to describe this evolution and interaction between Black and white players and professional teams, etc. The same thing was kind of happening in the jazz world. Benny Goodman had very successful records produced in the mid-30s, but he never identified his piano player. At the time, it was a trio. The piano player was Teddy Wilson. I'm not a jazz or musical expert in any way, but the playing of Teddy Wilson is so smooth. I encourage everyone to listen to him. But America didn't know the identity of the pianist on Benny Goodman's records. That was private. But then in 1937, he was encouraged to go public with his integrated band. It was the Benny Goodman Quartet, and it featured Teddy Wilson again on piano, Lionel Hampton on the vibes, and Gene Krupa was the drummer, and a very successful quartet. And then 2 years later, in 1939, he created the sextet. That's the last numerical evolution, thank goodness. But he created a sextet and invited in Charlie Christian, a great Black jazz guitarist, and the first to electrify the guitar. So just a real prodigy. So KC Swing was rhythmic, up-tempo, soul-based dance music, and it attracted dancers from all around the Midwest and the Plain States.
Your time's up.
Is it?
Yes.
Can I have one more minute?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, I'm so sorry. Barnstorming, the KC Monarchs had the barnstorm, so they had to have a strategy. And so they would barnstorm with league teams like the Chicago American Giants, the House of David, who were very successful barnstormers. The House of David were popular, high-quality white baseball. Again, this interaction was promoted white and Black baseball at a highly competitive level. They eventually hired Black and white players in order to improve their quality. So Satchel Paige, Three Fingers, Mordecai Brown, etc., all played for the House of David, and they had their own all male and female jazz bands. Now, briefly, race pride is largely about racial identity and respect, and so they would play both in baseball and in music battles or competitions in order to celebrate their talent and to make a little bit extra money during the Depression. And then finally, Eric Weiner discovered that there are certain conditions where clusters of geniuses can appear. And I would say they tend to occur where people in place meet. They occur where chaos and adversity exists. They require some funding. They often are associated with a strong sense of community and civic engagement, and they look the outside for ideas. So think about Kansas City and the things we mentioned. And the last slide, thank you for the extra minute. My friend and family, we went to Kansas City to Kauffman Stadium And in the sea of blue seats, there's one red one to recognize Buck O'Neill and all of his contributions to Black baseball, American baseball, and being an ambassador and a humanitarian. And there's also, I went to the Phillips Art Museum in Washington, D.C., which is an incredible art gallery. And meeting me as I entered the door was this beautiful quilted colored image of Charlie Parker. And in the image, you can see his saxophone is sort of transitioning into a bird. He was known as the Bird. And so the legacy of this incredible accomplishments in jazz and baseball and their shared story, I think is just fascinating to read about, but also I think that the incredible, beautiful soundtrack helped America deal and get through a very difficult time during the Depression. Thank you very much.
Time for a couple questions before they kick us out of the theater. Yes?
First, Frank, great job, thank you. Have you read Preston Lauderbeck's book, The Chitlin Circuit, which really talks about not just jazz, but blues music? Because if you went to the Red Sox games in Memphis, you got chitlins, 2 bottles of hot sauce, you could smell it a mile away. That chitlin circuit was huge in Memphis, and to piggyback off of that, Red Sox catcher Larry Brown, I believe his daughter-in-law was in Detroit last year at the last Malloy, Dolores, talks about Lionel Hampton and Larry Brown were dear friends that would still visit years later at the Len Elmore Hotel in Memphis. So there's connections not just with jazz, but also with blues with those players. But I was just interested to see if you'd come across Lauderbeck's book on the Chitlin Circuit.
No, so when I first read about the Chitlin Circuit, I just thought, you know, first of all, I read about the players, the musicians, etc. They'd be playing in a very, you know, insecure environment, and then they would finish their playing, but, you know, they had no place to stay and no food, and there was no money. And so I go, you know, when I found out that Chitlin Circuit actually was a screening tool for them, I go, wow, this is just a great opportunity. But no, I have not read about its impact on blues. I wish I was, you know, a little bit more sophisticated with regard to music, but this is my interests. I wish I had time to explore more of that because it's truly fascinating and fun to read.
I'll suggest 2 more aspects of comparing white and black jazz and baseball. One is improvisational and the other is dynamic. During that time, if you're listening to saxophone players, you can tell a white sax player from a black sax player. Another way to put it is to say that Lionel Hampton did for Benny Goodman what Jackie Robinson did for the Dodgers.
I think that's such a cool comment. As you can see, we're kind of limited on time, Clem. So yeah, there's fascinating things to explore, and I think your description is just right on. When I mentioned the elements that comprise the origins of jazz, improvisational harmonies and instrumentation were the very foundation of the jazz elements. So as it plays out, whether it's a band in KC or New York, you're going to see those differences. I think when we heard that description of Jackie's first game in Jersey City, we knew what dynamic meant versus other options that the people had watched before that. Any other questions?
One more.
More of a comment that kind of talks about the tie between the two. Hinchcliffe Stadium was not just a ballpark, but also hosted concerts, boxing, so on and so forth. And Duke Ellington played one of his last concerts there in 1971. So it's an interesting kind of full circle.
Wow, that's so interesting. Yeah, we went, my wife and I went to Hinchcliffe, and we didn't know you couldn't get in unless it was a Jackals game. So we were trying to, you know, we looked like we were going to try to jump the walls, which we couldn't. But yeah, when you read the history, I mean, they sponsored road races with the cars and everything. So how cool is that Ellington played there with his last concerts? Thank you.
And thank you.
Thank you.